Welcome everyone to this online event at the Swindon Festival of Literature 2021. Thank you very much for joining us. We do hope that everything is well where you are. We're both pleased and grateful that human ingenuity, cutting-edge science and digital technology make it possible for this show to go on, well, at least to go on online. Now, please note, this event is both being recorded for people who couldn't get up at 11 o'clock and watch it live, and live streamed for an audience online, but only the host, the author, and the interviewers will be seen. If you would like to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If your question is chosen, you have a choice of asking the question in person and being seen on live stream, or asking the host to ask on your behalf. If you want your question to be asked but do not want to be seen, please prefix your question with unseen. Phew, hope that's all clear. Now, distance running and ultra running. Now, two of the fastest growing activities in the world. Why? Were we made to run? Is it a symptom of a modern ailment? Or is it a healthy antidote to modern life? Is it the perfect kind of endorphin and dopamine self-inducing drug? Does it make us fitter or more fanatic? Does running ultra distances make us nicer people? Why do we do it? Today's guest author of 2 books on distance running may have some answers, and today's co-interviewers and you out there online may have some questions. Please join me in giving a Swindon Festival of Literature and Swindon running community welcome to guest co-interviewer and Swindon park runner, Sarah Kate Tonkin, and today's guest author, who has recently as yesterday, I believe, run a marathon, is a journalist whose most recent book is titled The Rise of the Ultra Runners, and here it is, and whose running journeys have taken him from the deserts of Oman to the snow-capped peaks of the Rockies and on to the Ultra Trail du Mont Blanc. And now finally, he's made it to Swindon. Welcome, Adharanand Finn.
Hello, nice to be here. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me as co-questioner. Thank you.
Great that you're both here. Would that we were all live doing this in Swindon, but we're not. We're online. And Swindon in the spring is lovely as Mont Blanc or Paris in the spring. What do either of you know about Swindon? Have you been to Swindon?
I'm afraid to say I've never been to Swindon, so it's a particular shame on that front that we couldn't be there in person today. And apparently we were going to do the park run, I think, and do it on the Saturday. So, or not that there is a park run, but some kind of run. So it's a shame, but one day I'll get there, maybe next year.
Whereas I'm a librarian in one of the Swindon secondary schools. I'm at Ridgeway, and I get the joy of coming with my Swindon Youth Festival of Literature hat on, which if I'd been better at technology, I'd have been able to do it so that the banner behind me was the right way around, but that was just beyond me. So yeah, no, I'm a big fan of Swindon. I really like it here. So come and see us at some point, Adharanand.
I will do.
That's great. Adharanand, we'd love you to run with us in Swindon. And Sarah Kate, the Literature Festival loves nothing more than someone who likes books and likes running. A librarian who runs, rock and roll. Okay, back to the topic in hand. Distance running, ultra distance running even. The subtitle of your book, Adharanand, is A Journey to the Edge of Human Endurance, which sort of says it all. And actually, for some of us, doing a weekly park run as hard as we can is a feat of endurance. Why do we do it? What's it all for? Adharanand, please tell us more.
Yeah, so I mean, that's the big question. And in a way, through all 3 of my books, I think that's been the key question I've been coming back to over and over. I think the first time I even ever thought about writing about running was because of that question, because I find there's an amazing disconnect between how you feel just before you go for a run. So just before you go for a run, I think it's pretty universal. You don't really want to go. And if someone said to you at that point, why do you go running? You'd probably say, I don't know. Why do I do it? I don't know. And I have many times we were going out with a running club and everyone's going, why do we bother? What are we doing? But then after the run, it feels completely different. After the run, if anyone says, why do you run? You feel like you could easily explain it, because you feel completely, you feel at one with the world. You feel completely relaxed. I mean, obviously there are exceptions. Maybe you've tripped over and hurt yourself or whatever. But if you, on most runs, you come back in a completely different state than you started. And I think that in itself, although of course that doesn't fully explain it, is the crux of it. So then you think, well, why is that? Why do we feel better? And I think there's something you said. I think we are born to run. I mean, there's a book, Born to Run, and it is about how, or part of it is about how in the whole animal kingdom, humans sit. There's a few things we're good at. We've got a good brain, but physically, there's not many things we're that good at. I mean, compared to most four-legged animals, we're pretty slow at sprinting. Usain Bolt would get beaten by most of the animal kingdom. We're not exactly brilliant at swimming, but running, long distance running, we're one of the best species at long distance running. We can run further. We actually evolved through long distance running, through persistence hunting. So our bodies are designed to do it. So in some way, I think there's an element of fulfilling your purpose when you run. You actually physically are doing what you're designed to do. And I, you know, there's a lot of other activities which we've invented, like cycling and golf, and they don't give you that same, I'm sorry to the cyclist, but cycling is not a natural thing to do. You know, you're hunched over in this mechanical machine, and you know, I mean, of course, there's a lot of benefits and a lot of good stuff to do with cycling, but in terms of that deep inner sense of being human and being one with yourself, I think running is one of the few things that actually ticks that box. And I think that triggers this sense of fulfillment and a sense of having done what you fulfilled your purpose. I mean, it's quite interesting. In Japan, there are these marathon monks. They run around this mountain. They do 1,000 marathons in 1,000 days. And it's quite a spiritual endeavor, obviously. And I kind of thought about it. I thought you wouldn't really get like cycling monks or golf monks. That would make no sense. But running monks, somehow that makes sense. These monks that run. So there's a kind of connection between running and kind of not spirituality, but that sense of being human, I think. And I think that's what the monks are doing. They're trying to get to their core. They're trying to get rid of all their ego and their personalities and get down to the core human underneath through running. Then I discovered, so I for years, I went to live in Kenya, ran with the Kenyan runners, went to live in Japan and wrote about Japanese runners. And I was very much a serious, in my mind anyway, a serious road runner. So I was running marathons. I was trying to get a 2:45 marathon, you know, 34-minute 10K. It was all about times, and I, you know, having spent time with elite runners, also that was very much my mindset. And I kept hearing about this ultra running on the periphery, but I wasn't that interested in it. To me, I saw videos of ultra runners, and they were kind of walking, and they were, you know, the time when I looked at the times looked really slow, like jogging, and I thought, well, that's not serious running. What I had failed to take into account is that sometimes these guys are running for 30, 40 hours non-stop and are going up and down mountains, and of course things are going to be slower. But the reason I fully got around to writing a book about it, it kind of grew on me slowly. There were a few key moments. So I thought I think in some ways they're reflective of where ultra running is and how I discovered it. Kind of helps it kind of put it in its context. So the first thing that happened, I was working in an office in London, and I went to get a drink. There's a tea point where you get your drink, and some guy in the office had heard that I was into running, and he said to me, "Oh, you do ultra marathons, don't you?" And I had never done an ultra marathon. I was in very much of this mindset that no, I don't do ultra marathons. So I said, no, I don't do ultra marathons. He said, "Oh, what, you do triathlons?" And I was like, "No, I don't do triathlons." He said, "What, just marathons?" And there was to me, that really sparked something. Marathons were now just marathons. Something had happened, something had changed. There was a time if you ran a marathon, it was quite a big deal. And this guy was slightly disappointed that I only ran marathons. And then the next thing that happened, I can't remember quite the time scale, but soon after that, I'm a journalist and I'd written books on running. So an editor from the Financial Times magazine contacted me and said, would I run an ultramarathon in Oman called the Oman Desert Marathon, 100 miles across the desert. And my instant reaction was, no, I don't do that kind of thing. You know, that's not, to me, that's not running. So I said no. But then I went home and I thought about it, and I started realizing that, like, from a point of view of someone who runs 10Ks and is interested in what your minute per mile time is, that wasn't a particularly interesting idea to run across the desert. But then as a life experience, as an adventure, as something that you could really, you could tell your grandchildren about one day, you running across the desert. And one of the stages that really appealed to me was at night. So you're running across the desert at night, just with all your stuff on your pack. And so I began to realize that ultra running is not just about running. And in some ways, the name ultra running is a bit of a misnomer. It's really ultra moving. It's just it is a real adventure. It's a kind of life experience. It's something you do. It's kind of beyond that feeling I was talking about with running, where running is about fulfilling your kind of inner urge to run. I think we all have that. But when you get into ultra running, particularly the longer ultra runs, you start getting into this almost realm of, I was talking to a famous ultra runner, Damien Hall, just the other day, and he's a brilliant ultra runner, one of the best in the world. He says he imagines he's Frodo when he's ultra running, and he's on a mission to save the world. And there's almost this sense that it becomes like this epic story that you're in, and you go through these incredible ups and downs, and life becomes incredibly intense on an ultra marathon. You get moments where you're crying, you're sitting on the trail crying, and then other moments you're euphoric. Dawn is breaking, you're in a mountain, you're on your own, you're heading down, and there's blue mist in the valley. And I mean, it's beyond running. And so what I realized is that ultra running is just like these epic adventures you go on, and life becomes much more intense, and the experience is much more intense. It's a lot of effort, of course. You get incredibly tired, and a bit like the contrary to running, after an ultra marathon, you swear you're never going to do another one again. It's like I've told myself that so many times. But then that pain, that the ultra runners call it the pain cave, that sense of suffering diminishes, and you remember back to that feeling of just that the intensity of it all. I think life then, when you go back to normal life, and the rest of life feels very easy, comfortable, and, dare I say it, at times a little boring compared to those experiences. And they really stand out in your mind, of all the days of your life that stand out, some of those moments on, out on the mountains, or 220 hours into a race where somebody showed you one moment of kindness or something like that. Just everything becomes more intense. So anyways, that's why I ended up kind of diving into this world of ultra running. There was one other thing that actually tipped me over the edge. I remember before I'd done an ultra run, so it was growing, and it's a hugely growing sport, ultra running. It's at the time I wrote the book in 2018, I'd worked out in the previous 10 years, the number of races and the number of participants had grown by 1,000% in 10 years. So this was huge growth. And so I was very intrigued by it as a journalist as much as a runner. And so I watched, it was a Friday night, and I watched the beginning of this race, the UTMB, which is a race I ended up running eventually. And it's 105 miles around the mountains. It starts in Chamonix in France. It goes into Italy, into Switzerland, does this big loop of Mont Blanc. So I'm in the office in London, and I watched the start of it on the computer, and it's quite an epic. They play this very stirring music. There's about 2,000 runners. You can tell everybody's about to go off on this very intense experience. And so then they set off. And then you watch it for a little bit, but I turned it off, and I actually live in Devon. So I got on the train, got the train down to Devon, got home, went to bed, got up the next morning, and suddenly remembered all those people are still out there running. They've been running since the night before. I logged on, and there they were running down the hills, and still I was like, God, that's crazy. They've been running all night. And then I had my Saturday and I did things. I can't remember what I did, but I went off with my family, did stuff. And that evening I came home and I thought, they're still running. And I logged on, and sure enough, there they were, running up mountains, running down mountains. And then bizarrely, the next day, Sunday, I got up and logged on, and they were still, I mean, some of them had finished by now, but I was just like, this is incredible. These guys are still out there. All this time they've been running without stopping. And that really intrigued me, and something just thought, right, I've got to give this a go. There's something going on here. And so there you go. That's my take on why we run, and why ultra running is running, but it's also something beyond running, which doesn't necessarily make it better, but it's got a whole intensity to it. And I'm still just as happy running a 5K, by the way. I mean, it's not like, I just see them as two different things. I can quite happily go out and really enjoy, you know, a 5K and just really having that intense few minutes of pushing yourself, your heart's bursting, your lungs are bursting. In ultra running, it's not like that. It's a kind of gradual wearing down process. At no point are you completely like eyeballs out. And so I enjoy both. I enjoy 5Ks. I enjoy, well, I say I enjoy ultra marathons. I don't know. I haven't done one for a while. You're right. Yesterday I did technically was a trail marathon, but it was 27.5 miles on very, very hilly trails on the south coast of Devon. And so it felt a little bit like an ultra marathon. And there was about 5 miles from the end, I was struggling a bit. And I remember thinking, now I remember why I hate ultra marathons. I hate them. And then 10 minutes after I finished, I was like, God, that was amazing. I'm so glad I did that. So there's a kind of conflict of emotions with running generally. I think it's an interesting thing. I think it's one of the few things that have such a huge disconnect between just before you do it and just after you do it. It's just, everything changes.
Adharanand, thank you very much. So much food for thought. And before I ask Sarah Kate for her first question, I'd like to begin with one that kept coming to me as you were talking. And when you said, for example, life can seem boring afterwards. And I'm afraid that's what one hears. And I'm a very keen tennis player and a keen runner. And sometimes my life just immediately afterwards seems a bit sedate. And I'm like you, I'm a good family man and all that, but there's nothing quite like what I get from tennis and from running. And the phrase, life seems boring when I'm not, has also been used by addicts and alcoholics. And I wonder to what extent, I mean, this is a rather controversial thing to say right at the start of us happy runners talking about running, but are we a little bit addictive in a way that could be obsessive and negative and not as good for the world as we think it is? Because it certainly feels good for us.
Yeah, I mean, it is a very interesting question. I was talking about this the other day, and in some ways, words like addicted and there is a lot of terminology, particularly in ultra running, I think, even more than regular running. I think you do find people talking about withdrawal symptoms and needing to get back to it. I mean, personally, I don't feel like I'm addicted. I quite enjoy returning to the sedate life for a while afterwards. I quite like the contrast, and then after a while, I want the intensity again, and then I want the calm, comfort, and I enjoy the contrast. But there are people who just want more and more of it, and it depends how it impacts on the rest of your life, I guess, because you could easily describe that as passion or dedication as opposed to addiction. And it depends whether it's healthy or not. And I guess if that's impacting other people in your life and you can't moderate it because you need it so badly, then potentially there's harm there. Physically, in most cases, I mean, right, like one of the big problems of being addicted to alcohol or drugs is they're harmful to you. I mean, that's why it's bad more than anything, unless, I guess, gambling or something, you're losing money, but there's some bad consequence to it. But if you're just running every day and you're fit and healthy and you're happy, well, then I think there's a good addiction there. If you're doing that to the detriment of your family, for example, and you can't stop because they need you, you can't stop, then so I think it depends on the impact. But in itself, inherently, I don't think it's a bad thing, because I think we are, like I say, I think we're designed to be moving and to be running and to be out there and to be part of the other thing about running is it takes you outside. I mean, I know some people run on treadmills, but it's generally accepted that running on a treadmill is never quite the same thing. In fact, interestingly, on a very quick aside, there's a brilliant book by a guy called Vibar Kriegen, where he talks about treadmills, and he delved into the history of them, and they were actually invented as a punishment for prisoners in the Victorian prisons, because they wanted them to do something that was hard but had no sense of satisfaction. And so it's very different running on a treadmill to running outside. So part of that experience, I think, is being out in the wind and the rain and the sun or whatever it is. And so I don't think that's a bad thing in itself, but it can become, especially with ultra running, because it takes a lot of time. Potentially some of these races are very expensive. So there is the potential for it to have a negative impact on other people potentially. And if you can't moderate that, then perhaps you've gone over a certain line. But generally, I think it's okay.
I'm glad you said that, and I hoped you would. And when you said family, a woman confided in me last year and came to me and said, I want to tell you that running, since I've been running, my children are less rude to me, and then she whispered, and my family like me more.
Yeah.
So there are the benefits for the family. Sarah Kate.
If you're more content with yourself, you're going to be a nicer person to be around, and you're going to be a better parent. And so, yeah, you can say that.
Absolutely. Sarah Kate.
Yeah, so Aaron, I've had the opportunity to read some excerpts from your book to a couple of classes, and I'm really glad you talked about the bit about oh gosh, you only run marathons, because that was exactly the passage I'd actually read to 2 different classes. And it's quite funny because I do triathlon, and I always say to my colleague who does marathons that I am infinitely cooler. If you can run while taking wetsuit off, that is cooler than being able to run and eat at the same time. He disagrees. But anyway, so I'd obviously read this passage out to my students, and my favourite question that a student came up with was, have you ever met anyone who hasn't been impressed when you tell them you're an ultra runner?
I love getting questions from kids or students, because they're always very, very interesting. That's a brilliant question, because in some ways I find with ultra running, what's so funny about it is that even just signing up for an ultra run, people are impressed. So as I was quite a purist before, I actually was quite proud of my 1 mile time. And I tell people my 1 mile, I say, oh yeah, I ran a mile. And they go, my grandmother can run a mile. It's like, that's not impressive. I'm like, yeah, but that's not the point. It's about speed. But then you tell anybody you run 100 miles across the desert, exactly, and everyone is impressed. Even if you sign up, yeah, I remember the weeks beforehand. Yes, I'm going to run 100 miles across the desert in Oman. People are like, what? Jaws dropping to the floor. And it is interesting, because that is partly what has fueled, I think, the rise in ultra running, and partly through social media and things like that, because people do suddenly get this kudos and this kind of respect from everybody. And I was talking to this guy, Damien Hall, who's a top ultra runner, and he was saying, although that's not why he does it, he says, you're not immune to that. You're not immune to realizing, he said the first ultra run he did, he had very sore legs on the train home, and he was rubbing his leg, and the guy next to him said, are you okay? And he told him what he'd been doing. And he said the guy nearly fell off the chair. And he said, yeah, God, everyone's really impressed by me suddenly. And it does make you feel good when people are impressed by you. And so, yeah, I tend to think it's definitely not why I do it, but it does, yeah, people are impressed. The answer is no. I don't think I've ever met anyone who isn't impressed.
Okay, thank you.
Here's a question from one of our worldwide audience, and we don't know where people are viewing us from. It's from someone called Sarah, and she addresses this question actually to Sarah Kate, but I want to address it to both of you, because as a writer and as a librarian, this is a perfect question at a literature festival. And the question is, As a secondary school librarian, and I'm going to add, and as a writer, Adharanand, how can the running-reading relationship be exploited to promote reading for pleasure in young people?
Who's going first?
Well, I'll tell you what, shall I go first? I talk about this a lot in school. When I go into different classes, my students get so used to me doing the analogy of running and reading, and there's so much you can do with both of it. But lots of it is about, there's a certain amount of training, because the thing with reading, we've got a lot of my students, if it hasn't grabbed them on the first page, they don't want to read the book. And I'm saying sometimes you have to make a bit of effort. And then there's also the analogy of sometimes you just want to do like a really easy run in the countryside. There's no speed and distance you're worried about. And that's the day when we pick a really easy book that we want to read. And sometimes we want to challenge ourselves a bit. And so we might pick a bit more of a challenging book. So yeah, I quite often talk to my students about the analogies of reading and running. And actually, I'm quite surprised how many of my English colleagues and my librarian colleagues all run as well. So there must be something about it.
Brilliant. Adharanand.
Yeah, I don't really know. The only thing I would say is that, I mean, if you're reading about something you have an interest in, and that I know running is not necessarily the most popular thing with kids usually, but it's usually when people get older they kind of find running. But I mean, I get a lot of comments from people who say, I haven't read a book in years, but I loved your book, and I first book I've read in years. And I think that's probably because they found a book that speaks to them because they love running. And so in a way, and there's a lot of people who love running, but in terms of that's about as much as I can say about it really. But brilliant answer from Sarah, and I can see why it was directed.
Okay, I want to go back to this ultra running, which, by the way, from now on I'm going to call ultra moving.
Yes.
So park running is real running, and this ultra stuff, this impressive ultra stuff, is ultra moving. But seriously, you spoke about how runners often feel before they run, and you spoke about how they feel after they've run. I want to focus a bit on how we feel when things aren't going too well during a run, and that feeling of wanting to give up. Why the hell am I doing this? This is too hard. And I asked a psychologist about this, not a runner, and she said it's the difference between us and animals, and you mentioned the animal kingdom, Adharanand, is that animals will just feel pain and they'll go on till, like cockerels will fight till one of them dies. Men generally sort of stop just before someone dies, or sometimes they do. And an animal will run until it can't run anymore. But we have this problem with our brain, that our brain is working on our behalf and thinking, do you know what? I can't do this. There's so many reasons I can't do this. I've got very important things to do tomorrow. I can't do this. And so our brain is playing tricks with us, or not playing tricks, it's advising us to stop. How can we get our brain to advise us to keep going?
Yeah, I mean, this is a brilliant, it's a thing. A South African sports scientist termed it the central governor theory, and he realized that people were getting, when people run and they exercise, they get tired and think they can't go on way before that actually happens. And he kind of observed that when runners feel like they've given everything, and they're sprinting to the line, even the top runners in the Olympics, they cross the line and then they're still walking around. They haven't collapsed. Often they go on a lap of honor. So wait a minute, you haven't given everything. So they realize that what happens is your brain is regulating your effort, and it does that by telling you you're tired. So it realizes that, wait a minute, you're getting tired. So I need to, and it comes from evolution. We came from this idea that we always had to save some energy for an emergency. So we might think we're tired and we might have run a long way, but a lion might jump out at any moment. So we need this extra burst of energy, and we always have it. And that happens you might feel you're exhausted. And I've had this in races, and then something happens, like a rock falls or something, you can suddenly sprint. That rock's about to fall on your head. You've got that energy in reserve. You can move. So your brain is being very clever, and in some ways it's being very reasonable, and you shouldn't really be overriding it. But the only thing what they've discovered is that your brain is actually a little bit overprotective, particularly in an environment where there aren't lions out there about to jump on you, and actually the chances of a real emergency are quite slim. And what I found particularly, and I think it's because we've become very used to having comfortable lives, that our threshold of tiredness and pain and endurance is quite low. So, and I think this is an advantage people like the Kenyans have, because they've lived much tougher lives. Their threshold where their brain starts panicking is much higher. And we've got, you know, for a lot of us who haven't run at all, you might go for a 2-mile run and you might think, I've got to stop, I can't carry on, because you haven't run, because your threshold is so low. It's just like, and everything's aching and you feel like you can't carry on, and well, your lungs are bursting. But what it is, it's your brain telling you that. It's your brain going into panic mode. And so once you realize that, that at least the first time, probably the second time, probably the third time that my brain tells me I can't carry on, it's like an overprotective mother who's, you know, just doesn't want you to hurt yourself or wear yourself out. And I realized it took me a lot of experience to learn this. And I think ultra runners often talk about this, is that because it's very powerful as well. And so even though you might know that in theory, you might hear me say that and go, okay, so next time I'm running and I'm tired, I'll just say, oh, I'm not tired. Well, it's not as simple as that, because it's a very overwhelming feeling and a sense and a thought. It's completely overwhelming. But the more times you go through that, and in a way, most runs, a 5K or a 10K or even a marathon, you might get to that point and then struggle to the end, but not actually come through it. But in ultra running, because it's so far, if you're going to finish, you're going to come through it, and you're going to be at a point where you feel like you can't carry on, you're completely exhausted, and then 2 hours later, you're going to be feeling fresh again. And then that makes you go, whoa, wait a minute, how can I feel fresh when I haven't stopped, I haven't rested, but I felt terrible 2 hours ago? And it's your brain is basically realizing you're not listening to it, and it's giving you back your energy reserves for now. And the more that happens, the more you begin to recognize it. And so these very experienced ultra runners, they know this is coming, they deal with it, they get through it, they have low patches, and you see this in races, people drop behind for a little bit and then they come back again. And so a lot of it is just experience. I mean, you can tell yourself, you know, if you're strong enough in your mind, you can, if you're prepared for it, I think that helps. So if you know, particularly in a long race, and it definitely could happen in a marathon where, you know, mile 15, 16, you think, I can't go on. But if you're prepared for that feeling, and you know that when that feeling comes, it's not actually, I'm not as tired as I think. It actually goes to the point where you feel pain. So I, at one point near the end, after I'd experienced this quite a lot of times, I was running a race in Italy, and I mean, for anyone who's read my book will know I suffered a lot from this. My brain was, I was completely wanting to drop out of every race. But I got to a point where I was running down this hill quite early in this race, and my knee started hurting quite badly, almost like it was injured. And I just instantly almost laughed, and I said, you're going to have to try harder than that, to myself. I said, no, I'm not falling for that. And instantly the pain went. It was just my brain creating a pain, because it just thought, oh God, we're not doing this again, are we? Come on, let's stop now. And so, yeah, so you can override it, but generally it comes from experience, and it comes from a kind of being prepared for it, because it can sneak up on you. Your brain can find all sorts of reasons you weren't expecting. Like I had some new shoes on one time, and I decided that was the problem. And turns out that wasn't the problem.
If you want more examples of how Adharanand deals with the pain threshold and the overprotective parent telling him you can't go up another sand dune to complete 100 miles across the desert, get this book. There are lots of examples in it. Let's go to another question from Sarah Kate.
Yeah, so following on from that, again, a lot of my students have been asking, how on earth do you cope with the mindset? But actually, another question on that base was purely, what do you think about when you run? And I get that, because I would say half marathon is my furthest distance, and even at that kind of distance, so you do kind of need to think about something. When you're running for 20, 30 hours, what are you thinking about all that time?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when I go for an easy run, you know, even a long run here when we're at home on the weekend, you know, my thoughts will be drifting and I'll be having crazy ideas. I'll be remembering things. It's just like, it's quite a nice time. Your thoughts are off drifting. And as a writer, I often get ideas for articles or things to write or, you know, things to do. I don't know. You get strange ideas.
Yeah.
But then when I'm in a race, it's funny, and that's why I quite like racing, and the intensity of the race, I'm just completely focused on my body and the race, and perhaps, you know, when you're in the mountains, of course, you take in the views as well. But I really am focusing. How am I feeling? Where am I going next? It's a complete, almost like tunnel vision on the race, which is quite.
Do you do that maths thing where you know how far you've been and how far you're going and what percentage of the race you've done and what percentage have you got to go? Or is that just me?
Yeah, I find that a very debilitating thought process, but I'm very prone to that. And what I realized, so I, after a while, stopped wearing my watch in the races because I would spend a lot of time calculating things like that out. And the problem is, as you get tired and you start covering the ground slower and slower, and in an ultra marathon, you could still have 40 miles to go. And you're exhausted, and that thought is just completely debilitating. So I found it better to not know how far you've got to go, not know how far you've been. Just know that if you keep moving, you'll get there. And just keep moving. But yeah, so I'm prone to that. And what pace am I going? But I'm very much focused on the race. What was the first part of that question?
I think I've been talking about sort of mindset and weather, but another one linked to that one was the again, when you're training, how do you plan your routes? So again, if you're doing long distances, and again, it's a student question, which I think is really lovely, because when you're just doing 5K, you know all the local 5K routes, don't you? Yeah. But if you've got to do a training run of, I don't know, 13, 14 miles, do you spend a lot of time planning it, or do you have lots of standard routes in your head?
I tend to have lots. I have lots of loops, and I tend to join them together. So I will go. So I'll do that loop, and then I'll do that loop. But what I've started doing recently is I've started exploring, which I find is really good fun. And because sometimes you think, oh, I've got to do this loop. But where I live, I live in the countryside, so there's lots of lanes. And so the other day there was one, it had a dead end sign, and I'd never been down it. I'd run past it like 100 times and never been down it. And I kind of, after a while, you do the same loops, it starts getting really boring. So I thought, I'm just going to go down there, see what's down there. I mean, I can't believe I've run past it so many times with no idea. Got down there, and right at the end, there was a little footpath, like a public footpath. And I ended up in this bluebell woodland that I didn't know existed, with these lovely trails running through it. And I just thought, this is brilliant. Just keep exploring. And as long as you know, you can, I've got quite a good sense of direction. So at the worst case scenario, if it's 5 or 6 miles, however far would be halfway. If I haven't got to somewhere I know I can loop back, then I'll just turn around and come back. Yeah. And if I'd got down that lane and just been a farmyard and there was no entrance, well, I would have just turned around and come back. It's fine. It's interesting because I read a book about Ethiopian running, and they do this. They run in the forest, and they don't have set routes. They actually play follow me leader. So one person's job is to be the leader that day, because they run in groups, and they just wander off the trails. They don't even follow the trails, just through the bushes and everything. And so I've started doing that. And it's quite good fun. I wouldn't do that every run, because sometimes you don't want to think about where you're going. You don't want that. It can be a little bit confusing sometimes, but it's a nice way to mix up your running, especially if you've got bored of doing the same loop. Also, I live near the sea, so there's the coast trail path, so you can just pick a bit of coast and go out and back is pretty nice. So
we're coming to the last 6 or 7 minutes of this. Well, this is really a park run of a talk rather than a half marathon or marathon or anything. So if Sarah Kate, if you think of your last question, here's my last one, and that is, now that we've sort of distinguished between running and ultra running, is there any advice you would give people who are keen 10K runners, half marathon, and have heard you say, what, just a marathon? And they're thinking, do you know what? I want to move on to the next level. And obviously the dividing line between the two isn't ultra clear, forgive the pun. Is there any advice you can give them? Anything you can say about don't do it, or unless your children are grown up, or unless somebody else is looking after and cooking for your family, don't do it. Or a bit of advice for somebody who's interested in ultra moving.
Yeah, I mean, I would say don't underestimate it. What I certainly did when I started is I thought, because I was quite confident marathon runner, that I could run an ultra marathon quite easily. And it's a lot more than running, like you say, ultra moving. I think there's a lot more involved. So you've got to think about what you're going to eat. You need the right kit. You need to plan. Often you need what they call a crew. So you have somebody. The first few races, I just turned up like I would for a road race with my stuff. They said go, and I started running. And then I get to these checkpoints, and I realize everybody else has got a crew. They've got people there helping them out, giving them food. And I thought, well, that seems a bit over the top. That's not very necessary. But then near the end of the race, you're feeling completely sorry for yourself and you want to give up. And they've all got someone geeing them up and giving them this pep talk. And I felt like the loneliest man in the world at that point, having nobody there. And I realized a crew is really important. So it is quite a big thing. Not only is it you've got to go and spend a lot of time out there, you've got to really, unless it's quite a short ultra marathon, which is just a bit further than the marathon. Once you get into the long ones, you need to kind of rope somebody else in to go and support you. So yeah, so don't underestimate it, both in terms of the actual completing it, but in terms of what's involved. It's a big undertaking, but if you've got the desire to do it, I think I wouldn't say don't do it. It's an amazing experience going through an ultra marathon. It's like living a very intense life in a very short period of time. You'll have. It's funny because I wondered when I wrote my book whether my experiences were quite unique to me, and whether other people would read it and think, God, he's a bit of a drama queen. He's totally, having all these emotional ups and downs. But the contrary has been the truth. Everybody said, you captured exactly what I feel. Yeah. So it was good to know that I wasn't the only one who would, who cried quite as often as I did.
Yeah. And
you cry a lot doing ultra marathon. Your emotions are so raw. It's just, and it's not always crying because you're sad. There's lots of. Yeah.
And as with mountaineers, I've heard it creates terrific bonds between people. Ron, Sarah Kate, your last question. We really need to move on.
So my last question is this is purely from my heart, which is that I was running the other day and I had literally 40 minutes between dropping a child off and picking child up again to fit my running. Now, I think your family setup is fairly similar to mine. So I'm wondering what Mrs. Finn thinks about your ultra running and how you fit it in around family life.
Well, there is this saying in ultra running, the ultra running widow, so there is a, and it is something you have, like I said earlier, you have to moderate that. And I find the only thing with ultra running is you don't actually, in the training, you don't do that many super long runs, but yeah, there is an element where I have to I can't go off on these long runs every week. And in a way, it was different to me because I was writing a book about it. In some ways, it was my job as well. So, I mean, I had another job as well, but it gave me a bit more license, I think, than someone in my position, but who was doing it purely as a hobby would have had. And I find that, yeah, a lot of, you do need a supportive partner, and yeah, I mean, she's fine with it, but there is an element where, she doesn't want me to disappear too often for too long. So it's a case of balance and
for my bit of running, I used a quote from the woman who spoke to me and said, "My family like me more. Run, your family will like you more." We have to stop there. We can't even deal with a couple of other questions from the World Wide Web asking us about injuries and training. That's a bit too big a topic to start right at the end. Sorry about that. We'll have to have you back live in Swindon to talk about that. From the Swindon Festival of Literature and the Swindon Youth Festival of Literature. Many thanks, Sarah Kate, for joining us today. But most of all, a Swindon Festival of Literature thank you to you, Adharanand Finn. Thanks very much. Till we meet again.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Nice to talk to you all. Thank you.